reading with you today. And this is taken from the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and some disciples left the synagogue and they went to the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. Jesus went to her, took her by the hand, and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. This is our story. Thanks be to God.
Thank you. God be with you. So as some of you know, I was out sick last week. A big thanks to Rob for taking over. Thanks, Rob, for jumping in a pinch. So appreciated. Yeah, I've got that thing that's going around and it's not fun. Which seems like the dumbest thing I can say, but 3 days in, I got to that point where the pain of boredom matched the pain of the flu, and I just got so overwhelmed and so done with it. I was just like, God, take me now. I am okay. If you just take my soul now and I just call it a day, I'm okay with this. But for whatever reason, God didn't answer my prayer. And so then my prayer changed to just heal me already. I'm done with this, I'm good, let's go. And so I just lay there for days thinking about healing, because that's what ministers do. We think about this kind of stuff when it comes up. And I was thinking about healing and all those stories in the Bible of Jesus healing. I was like, one more would not hurt you. Come on. And then I got around to thinking, well, just what do we mean when we ask to be healed? Just what are we actually talking about? Because we've all asked that, right? We've all prayed for healing, whether it's for ourselves or for a loved one or for our world. We've all prayed for that. And so this morning, what I want to do is talk about what we talk about when we talk about healing. I want to look at what Jesus is actually doing in all these stories like the one we just heard. And then we're going to end by looking at some questions that can maybe pull us into the kind of healing that we're supposed to be looking for as individuals, but also as a community of faith. But let's start with the story that Suzanne just read. You with me? Sounds good? And so the story begins, it's super early on in Jesus' ministry. He's just started calling some disciples. He's only got 4 so far. He's got 2 sets of brothers. He's got James and John and Peter and Andrew. And when the story opens up, we're told that they're going to Peter's mother-in-law's house, which is interesting because suddenly we learn that Peter's married. Nowhere else in the Gospels do we hear about the families of the disciples. We hear them mentioned when James and John get called away from their father's boat, but nowhere else in these stories do we learn that they've actually got families. Peter's married. Maybe he's got kids. And so suddenly we learn a whole bunch about these guys who've been called by Jesus to follow him, which opens up all kinds of conversations we could have about the cost of following Jesus. And how does a life of faith and spirituality reorient and reprioritize our values and our time and our effort? But that's another sermon for another day. So they get there. And one of the interesting things about the story is that his mother-in-law is not named. For being a really big part of this story, it's really interesting that she's not named. And now this could be because of good old ageism and patriarchy. It could be a literary device where we're supposed to see ourselves in the story. Often if the character's not named, that's the writer's way to say, like, that's you. That's where you need to put yourself into this story. But because, we believe that women are more than just plot devices, let's name her. Let's call her Ruth. What do you want to call her? What's her name? Ruth? We're going to call her Ruth. All right. And so Ruth, we're told, is in bed with a fever. And Jesus, without saying a word, goes to the bedroom, lifts her up, heals her, where suddenly Ruth gets up and goes and makes sandwiches for everybody. And that's the story. And so now, whenever I tell this story, 99% of the time, 99% of the people have no issue with the fact that Jesus went all zippity-boppity boop and just healed someone. They're like, cool. But the fact that Ruth made sandwiches, hold the phone. Jesus healed someone to make him a sandwich? And we get all out of sorts. And now for years, I would be right there with you. I'd be like, no, he didn't. And I would bend over backwards to tell this as a story where her serving them is a response to, but not the outcome of her healing. I would need a way where no, a man did not heal a woman to serve him. That can't happen. Nope. Jesus is a feminist. He's socially progressive. This cannot be. But now, years later, here's my take. That's exactly what he did. I think that's exactly what is going on here in this story. So hear me out before you get all upset. In order to see this, in order to understand what Jesus is actually doing, to get a better perspective on healing, let's remember one of the base notes of our faith. Let's remember a truth that holds everything up. This thing that once we get this right, we kind of get everything else right. And it's this thing I say so often that you make fun of me for it. I was hanging out with Dave Skorick a while ago. He's a member of the church. And he's like, oh, I wasn't going to come today because then I'd just hear Nick tell a story about what it means to be human and alive in the world and what else is new. And at first I thought I'd be offended by him mocking me because that's exactly what I talk about every single Sunday. But I was like, no, that is what I talk about every single Sunday because that is the base note of our tradition. That what Jesus is about is showing us this new way to be human and alive in the world. And what I mean when I say that all the time is that when it comes to being human, when it comes to existing, it is not a physical or a biological thing. But being human is a spiritual thing. It gets at this idea that we only really become truly human when we choose to be the people that God made us to be. That we aren't actually alive until we're caught up in God's Spirit. That we only become human and alive in the world when we are rooted in love and we take up the identity and the purpose we find in helping God create a world where everyone has enough and everyone has a place. Think of that line from Braveheart. Not every man dies, but not every man truly lives. It's that. And what Jesus is about is showing us this much deeper, more spiritual way to exist in the world that we're always meant to have, but not everyone chooses to do. Life, our tradition would say, only begins when we choose to do that. It only really begins when we step out into this new way of being human and alive in the world. And here's why we're talking about that today. Because not only does it shift our focus to life before death instead of life after death, but it changes dramatically what we talk about when we talk about healing. Because when we talk about healing, when we talk about being cured, when we talk about being put back together, when we talk about restoration and wholeness, when we talk about those stories in the Bible and lean in here, when we talk about our own searches and journeys for healing, what that truth reminds us is that we're not just talking about physical ailments, but about something so much more expansive than that. And now this is not me saying that the physical didn't happen. That's not me saying those miracles, that's just a metaphor. This is not me saying we should not pray for physical healing. But it is me saying when it comes to healing, our scope needs to widen because we're not just talking about the physical, but we're also talking about the repair and restoration of that deeper sense of our humanity. We're also talking about the repair and restoration of the kind of world that God wants us to have. Are you with me? And what you can see in every single story of Jesus healing someone is that the physical miracle isn't actually the miracle. In every single story, he's actually repairing and restoring something so much more beautiful and so much bigger. And just to give you a taste of it, let's think of the story of the woman who's bleeding. And so the story goes, there is a woman, she's hemorrhaging blood, and she's been hemorrhaging blood for years. It's like 12 years or something like that. And she has spent all her money and all her time searching for a cure. And she's desperate and lonely and so confused. And then she goes up to Jesus and boom, Jesus heals her. Her bleeding stops, her pain stops. Amazing, gorgeous, right? But zoom out a little bit, because that's not actually the miracle. Even more beautiful from that is how she was healed from the cultural shame of being a woman. And even more beautiful than that is how her healing allowed her to be restored back into her community, back into her family. But even more beautiful than that is how that restoration back into the community made her community realize that it was worse off without her. And it made them begin to question the very system and culture that excluded her in the first place and made them call it out so that story does not happen to somebody else. And so suddenly, through that one healing of the physical, Jesus is changing and turning over the entire system that excludes and marginalizes people in the first place. Beautiful, right? Yeah, that's the healing in the healing. That's the actual miracle. Or take the story of the guy who couldn't walk and he's been laying on his mat for 40 years. And Jesus heals him and says, take your mat up and go. And the guy walks off. Yeah, beautiful. He can walk again. Amazing, great, cool. But even more beautiful is how Jesus, by saying, take your mat with you, is redeeming the guy's entire story. And saying your suffering and your pain, that's not something you should get rid of. That's not something you should leave behind, but that's actually a part of who you are. And so you need to take that story with you, and you need to tell your story, because your suffering, your pain, your journey, it matters. And that too is redeemable. That's made you who you are. So go and tell your story. Healing and a healing. He changes everything. And so what Jesus is doing here is just so brilliant when you see it. He's changing the entire scope of what we think needs to be healed. He's showing us that we need to change how we think about what needs to be healed. And he's showing us that when it comes to healing, it's never just about the physical. It's never just about the individual, but it's always about the whole. It's always about the collective. It's always about the system. It's always about changing that deeper sense of our humanity and trying to create a more just and expansive world for everyone. And once they see these stories that way, oh man, everything begins to change. They take on a whole new weight. And we can really begin to ask that question that we're supposed to ask with all these stories. Well, how is this story my story? How am I mistaking the physical for the spiritual? How do I need to widen my scope and how I look at our world? When it comes to our CFP, our community food program, for example. Oh yeah, we can change hunger, sure, let's give them a meal. Oh, but let's zoom out. Why are they there in the first place? Oh, what is going on in our world where we have to feed 200 plus people every single Friday? Why are they marginalized? How do we actually fix that connection? How do we actually fix that system? Suddenly we're actually in the work of Jesus' healing. Because it's not just about the individual, it's about the whole. It's about a deeper sense of humanity and about what's going on in our world. And so that takes us back to Ruth. Because here is what Jesus is doing. And I think this is something that I know I need to see and remember all the time. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's something that we all need to see and remember all the time. Because what Jesus is doing here with Ruth is, yes, he's healing her from the flu, and the flu sucks, and it's awful, and it's gross. Yes, beautiful, amazing. But he's also up to something else. And so what else is he doing? What else is he healing? What else can you see in here? And I love it because the writers put it right in front of us. It's a thing that made us all get tripped up. And we trip over it and we can't see the actual meaning Jesus is offering here. Because yes, he heals her flu. Great, lovely. But if you zoom out a little bit, he's also healing a really essential part of that woman. This essential part of her and our humanity, this part that's the first to go whenever we're sick. But it's also the part that we so often bury and try to kill off or see as optional. This part that if you want to be truly alive and human, you have to honor. And it's this part of her that was made to serve. Because to be human means to serve. It means to be a helper. It means to be someone who goes out into the world, sees a need, and responds to it. And what Jesus is doing here is saying you're made to serve. Not because you're a woman, not because you're the mother-in-law, but because you are human. And if I'm going to bring you into life, if I'm going to make you well again, you serve. Because that is where we discover life as it's meant to be. And we know this, right? Think back to a time when you've served. Think back to a time when you've helped out. How's it feel? Good, right? Yeah, it feels joyful, amazing. I remember doing youth ministry and going out to like the food kitchen with the group. And the guys are always like, oh, this is so dumb. I don't know why we're doing this. And they just get all snarky about it. But then by the end of it, they're like, I feel amazing. Why do I feel so good, Pastor? Like, wow, that feels great. You're like, yeah, no, like, makes you feel good. Of course it does, because that's who you were made to be. That is you becoming alive. That is you becoming truly human. But for all kinds of reasons, and we can call these all sicknesses because of greed, apathy, complacency, indifference, anxiety, fear, busyness. What do we do with that part of ourselves? We just set it aside. We see it as extracurricular. We see it as, oh, I'll do that when I retire. Oh, I'll do that. Someone else can do that for now. I'll get to it later. But I wonder what the writers of the story are doing here is saying, if you want to be healed, if you want to experience life as it's meant to be, you got to serve. You got to make sandwiches. You got to step into that existence where you exist for the sake of somebody else, because it's there. It's there you become truly and fully alive. So of course she made sandwiches. Of course that's exactly what Jesus was doing, because he knows we were made to serve. We were not made to stay in bed sick. We're not made to stay super busy. We were made to serve. And he pulls her back into life because that's what we do. And so some questions for you as we finish up. So when it comes to healing, how can you look at it differently this week? How can you pray for it differently? Maybe it's for yourself, maybe it's for the world, maybe it's for someone else. But how can you zoom out enough to see what the actual issue is? And how can you begin to work for the healing in the healing? And when it comes to service, what sickness is holding you back? What excuse are you making up that stops you from serving others? How can you go out and serve someone? Maybe it's the smallest thing. Maybe it's going to go clear their walkway after church today. Maybe it's volunteering somewhere. Maybe it's getting involved here. It doesn't matter. But what does is that you are made to serve. You will come alive when you serve. You will step into a whole new level and depth of existence when you serve. So as you go from this place, remember that. Remember what it means to be human. Remember what it means to be healed, and may you step into life as it was meant to be. During this next part of the service, there's some people in the back who would love to pray for you. There's some candles you can light back there. You can sit, you can journal, you can sing along, do whatever you need to do. But use this time to remember who you are and who you are made to be and where life actually is found. And may grace and peace be with you.